California's energy debate is shifting fast. Governor Newsom, once a fierce critic of big oil, is now looking for ways to keep refineries open and boost in-state drilling. With two major closures looming, what does it mean for gas prices, climate goals, and consumers?
A major California oil pipeline is shut down. Almost overnight, that decision pushed roughly 100 additional trucks per day onto the roads in Kern County. State oil production has already fallen to around 250,000 barrels per day, a fraction of historical levels. According to producer Steve Layton, the issue isn't just one pipeline, it's the system behind it: production, refining, delivery. If one piece weakens, the rest feels it.
So we consume a lot of gasoline. We cannot have refineries close and limit the ability to provide fuel to Californians. So why did these two refineries get everybody's attention? That's 20% of the fuel supply of the state.
Layton's field alone produces about 5,000 barrels per day. Until December, that crude flowed directly through the San Pablo pipeline. Now it moves by truck. More cost, more logistics, less efficiency. This didn't happen suddenly. Permitting delays slowed drilling across Kern County. Fewer wells meant lower volumes. Lower volumes made the pipeline harder to sustain. As throughput declined, the economics tightened. What looked manageable months ago is now structural pressure. Then came the refinery shock. Pipeline volumes were already sliding when news broke that refinery capacity was shrinking. In the Bay Area, only two major buyers remained: PBF and Valero. In the fall, Valero announced it would cancel contracts and stop shipping oil through the line in December.
So what happened is, in April, the governor got interested in this topic and said, "I'm worried, and Energy Commission, go figure it out." That response came back to the governor and pointed out certain actions that have to be taken, and those are now going to be considered in the next 30 days.
That announcement changed the equation. Producers weren't facing weak fuel demand. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, asphalt, end markets remained stable. The bottleneck was refining capacity. With fewer facilities processing crude, the system simply couldn't absorb the barrels. California producers watched the price gap between local crude and global benchmarks widen from roughly 3% to about 13%. That swing meant $5 to $6 less per barrel. In a $50 pricing environment, that is not minor, it cuts straight into margins.
This is a critical time for California. A couple of refineries that decided to leave. What can happen with the gas prices?
The cost of business in California for these refineries at least 2 times higher than running any other refinery in the world.
By year end, most operators secured alternative buyers in Kern County or Los Angeles. Some barrels went into storage. But when the San Pablo pipeline stopped moving nearly 30,000 barrels per day, the math changed fast. Those barrels had to move. For many companies, including Layton's, that meant trucks instead of pipe. Higher cost, more coordination, less efficiency. Of the 30,000 barrels that once flowed through San Pablo daily, around 15,000 are now hauled by truck. That single shift has added close to 100 trucks per day to Kern County roads compared to just a few months earlier. The oil still moves. It just moves the expensive way.
So when you think from a company's perspective, and they have their investors and they have their boards, when they put capital into a company expecting a rate of return, and the cost is continuing to go up, and you're not going to be able to make the investments to remain economic, then you're going to shut down.
The root cause was economic. In September, the pipeline operator filed an emergency tariff request, citing losses of roughly $2 million per month. Their break-even level was about 60,000 barrels per day. Actual throughput had fallen to nearly half that, around 30,000. Running at half capacity strained the model. Even at 30,000 barrels per day, the pipeline could technically function, but it wasn't sustainable financially. A tariff increase may lower the break-even threshold by raising revenue per barrel. Still, pipelines are built for scale.
And California is not, one, a place that's been open for business to our industry, and two, costs continue to pile on to the point where a Phillips or a Valero would say, we got better places to invest our money.
Below a certain volume, both the economics and the physics begin to work against you. Operators attempted to keep the line alive by batching oil through different segments where lower volumes were still workable. That can help in the short term, but as crude moves farther north toward the Bay Area, higher throughput becomes critical. Pipelines are engineered for flow. Without scale, both the mechanics and the economics start to unravel. There are two hard limits. One is physical. At a certain point, volumes fall so low the system simply cannot operate efficiently no matter the price. The other is economic. Even with the approved tariff increase lowering the break-even threshold, volumes may still be too thin to justify restarting.
That's why the governor sent a letter to the Energy Commission and said, I'm worried. We need to look.
And so far, there are few signals that a restart is imminent. Then there's the buyer problem. With Valero stepping away, PBF stands as the only major buyer at the north end. A single customer model introduces concentration risk. If that buyer reduces intake, the route effectively loses its anchor. Exporting crude is theoretically possible, but that would require new infrastructure, permits, and commercial agreements. None of that happens quickly. This is no longer just about one pipeline, it's about investment confidence. Refiners face capital cycles that can require hundreds of millions of dollars every few years for maintenance and upgrades. Investors and lenders look for stability before committing that kind of funding.
California has spent years, really decades, going after the fossil fuel business in the name of environmentalism, and it's a lie. Saying it was planning the state a clean energy future.
When policy direction feels uncertain, capital waits. When capital waits, projects stall, producers slow drilling, pipelines thin out, refineries reassess. And once infrastructure begins to contract, reversing that trend becomes far more difficult than stopping it. Industry leaders make a straightforward argument: if a cheaper, fully scalable replacement for oil were ready today, markets would already be shifting at full speed. Yet petroleum still accounts for roughly 32% of total U.S. energy consumption. In California, liquid fuels remain deeply embedded in transportation, aviation, freight, and logistics. For now, oil is still part of the operating backbone.
When it was all a con. The result, refinery closures. That's in the last 30 some odd years. An industry exodus, and of course, skyrocketing prices.
Producers also highlight regulatory structure. California enforces some of the most stringent environmental standards in the country. Importing crude from overseas adds ocean transport, longer supply chains, and additional cost layers. From their perspective, producing locally keeps tax revenue, employment, and oversight within the state's regulatory framework. At the same time, economic pressure is real. Consumer sentiment in California has fluctuated alongside higher living costs and energy price volatility.
California, it's I need to govern for a narrative. I need there to be anything shoplifted under $1,000. We don't need to arrest you for that. We don't need cash bail.
Energy policy discussions are no longer abstract. They intersect directly with affordability, jobs, and long-term planning. Against that backdrop, the state recently approved permits for roughly 2,000 new wells in Kern County. On paper, that looks significant. More permits suggest potential production growth. But permits are not production. Turning approvals into flowing barrels requires rigs, crews, equipment, infrastructure, and most importantly, capital. Right now, the economics are tight. Producers in Kern County are receiving prices in the low $50 per barrel range. Just 6 months ago, that number was closer to $70. A $15 to $20 swing per barrel can redraw an entire drilling budget.
Okay, we don't need to arrest criminals. We want this green utopia. And like what happens with that is you go from 2%, you start at 13% of the U.S. oil production in the U.S. Now we're down to 2%. Okay, it's still...
Margins shrink fast. Expansion plans slow even faster. Add seasonal factors and momentum softens further. winter conditions typically reduce drilling activity, limiting how quickly permits can turn into production. Approval on paper does not mean barrels tomorrow. Companies still have to decide whether the price environment justifies the risk. If those 2,000 permitted wells were drilled, completed, and tied into working infrastructure, volumes could rise enough to support stronger pipeline throughput. But timing is everything. Production growth depends on stable pricing, reliable buyers, and policy clarity that extends beyond a single legislative cycle. There's also a deeper debate about reserves. Some argue Kern County's best days are behind it. Operators on the ground disagree. In many California fields, only a fraction of oil in place has been recovered. In some mature assets, cumulative production represents just 20% of estimated reserves. That leaves substantial volumes technically recoverable with sufficient investment in modern techniques. In other words, the constraint is often economic and regulatory.
Close to between 5 and 10% of their overall revenue for California comes from the energy industry. It is an unbelievable state. It is one of the most, if they not most beautiful state in the union. You have technology, you have Hollywood, you have amazing natural resources. Yet somehow, these lefties have found a way to almost completely ruin it.
Not geological. Capital access, price volatility, and long-term policy direction shape output far more than the rock itself. The Poso Creek field is one example. Around 2000, it was producing only a few hundred barrels per day after prior owners stepped away. Over 2 decades of phased development, output climbed sharply, reaching nearly 15,000 barrels per day at its peak in early 2020. The resource was always there. What changed was the willingness to invest. Even without major new development since early 2020, the field still produces roughly 5,000 barrels per day. When it was acquired, total oil in place was estimated at about 600 million barrels. So far, only around 80 million barrels have been produced. The gap between resource and recovery is substantial. By 2000, cumulative production since the 1940s stood near 80 million barrels. Over the next 25 years, new operators added nearly 30 million more barrels on top of that total. A field once considered mature delivered tens of millions of additional barrels. That alone challenges the idea that decline equals depletion. Under stable market conditions, projections suggest another 20 to 30 million barrels could be recovered over the next decade. If realized, total production would approach levels that once seemed unrealistic after the asset had been largely written off. The larger takeaway is structural. Falling output does not automatically mean the resource is exhausted. Often it reflects reduced investment. When capital flows and technology advances, recovery rates improve. Across Kern County, significant volumes remain in place relative to what has been produced. Operators argue the fundamentals are clear. The geology is known, extraction methods are established, and infrastructure expertise already exists. The limiting variables are capital, regulatory clarity, and price stability. Align those factors, and production could rise meaningfully.
And gas is expensive there because of all the regulations, all the rules about the blends. You're talking about the oil that they use to refine, that they have to bring it in, but then they want to make it, cleaner than clean. It's not even, something that you need to do. Our oil here in the United States is very clean. The technology.
Potentially supplying a larger share of in-state demand. With roughly 100 additional trucks now hauling crude each day, the trade-off is visible. Pipelines are built for volume and efficiency. Trucks add fuel consumption, road congestion, scheduling complexity, and higher operating cost. The system still functions, just less efficiently. The price impact is clear. Moving oil from eastern Kern County to pipeline stations on the west side, about a 100-mile round trip, costs roughly $5 per barrel. Trucking directly to refineries in the Los Angeles area can run between $8 and $10 per barrel. In a low $50 price environment, that spread materially compresses margins. Transportation alone can erase a meaningful share of profit. If pipelines remain offline, more barrels shift to highways. Some truck traffic already moves within Kern County corridors, but scaling that model raises costs across the supply chain. What was once fixed infrastructure becomes rolling logistics. On imports, operators highlight regulatory contrasts. California enforces strict emissions controls, including tight oversight of flaring and venting practices. Standards vary globally depending on jurisdiction and infrastructure. Supporters of local production argue that shorter transport distances and established regulatory oversight reduce certain logistical impacts, though every supply source carries its own environmental considerations. When excess natural gas cannot enter a pipeline, operators must manage it under regulatory requirements. In some regions worldwide, flaring or venting practices differ based on local rules. In California, routine venting is not permitted. Facilities are required to monitor for leaks, conduct inspections, and correct even minor issues promptly. In urban areas, especially, compliance thresholds are stringent and small leaks can trigger immediate repair obligations and reporting procedures. Companies operate under layered oversight. Internal inspections run continuously, supported by leak detection systems and routine audits. At the same time, state and local regulators conduct independent reviews. Equipment issues must be corrected quickly to remain compliant. There is little margin for delay. California's regulatory framework is widely considered among the strictest in the country. Emissions controls, reporting requirements, and inspection protocols are embedded into daily operations. Industry representatives argued this constant scrutiny creates accountability and traceability that differ from many other producing regions. Inside state government perspectives vary. Some policymakers question the long-term role of oil. Others focus on enforcing existing laws rather than steering outcomes. But over the past 10 to 15 years, the volume of regulations, rule updates, and local ordinances has expanded significantly. Many requirements overlap. Compliance often means extensive documentation, layered approvals, and legal review. When disputes arise, they frequently move to the courts. Agencies can face litigation whether they approve a project or deny it. That reality introduces caution into decision-making. Recent measures, including setback regulations such as SB 1137, have intensified scrutiny. Ongoing legal proceedings continue to shape operational boundaries. For investors and operators, that means planning under evolving rules rather than fixed ones. None of those elements are immediate, and the larger concern is competitiveness. If refining capacity and production continue shifting outward, California's energy system becomes more reliant on external supply. That reshapes logistics, pricing dynamics, and long-term investment patterns. Pipeline flexibility is limited. Refined fuels move to Arizona and Nevada, and natural gas flows into the state through interstate pipelines. But there are no major outbound crude oil pipelines. If in-state refining declines, options narrow quickly. About a decade ago, companies explored expanding crude by rail capacity. A major proposal on the Central Coast aimed to scale up rail deliveries significantly. It faced strong opposition and did not receive permits. While limited rail shipments still occur, large-scale expansion remains uncertain from both economic and regulatory standpoints. The economic footprint is substantial. Estimates place the oil and gas sector's total contribution to California's economy between $300 and $330 billion annually. When accounting for direct, indirect, and induced activity, that equates to roughly 8 to 9% of state GDP. The stakes are not marginal. Industry leaders describe this period as a tipping point, not a collapse. Recent permitting approvals in Kern County provide incremental relief, but energy development is capital intensive. Large projects can take years before returns materialize. If policy direction shifts within a single legislative cycle, capital providers may hold back. The underlying issue is time horizon. Energy infrastructure is built on multi-year planning windows. When the perceived runway shortens, investment slows. That slowdown, more than geology or demand, may determine the trajectory ahead. And the greater risk may be structural. If 2 additional refineries were to close, the state could fall from 7 major facilities to 5. In 1990, California had roughly 34 operating refineries. The contraction over 3 decades underscores how much the system has already changed. With the San Pablo pipeline largely offline, northern market access is already tight. More crude is flowing toward Los Angeles area refineries. If additional facilities in either region were to close, the number of in-state buyers would shrink further. Fewer buyers mean thinner competition. Thinner competition changes investment math. Producers are managing several pressures at once: global price volatility, a widened California crude differential, regulatory complexity, and shifting refining capacity. Large capital projects are not short-term bets. They require multi-year planning, stable signals, and confidence that market access will remain intact. Without that foundation, hesitation becomes rational. Still, risk is not new to this industry. Exploration success rates have historically hovered near 10%, yet drilling continues. That tolerance for uncertainty shapes how operators frame the current environment. Challenges are seen as variables to manage, not immediate exit triggers. The decision to remain in California ultimately comes down to geology. The state's oil formations, particularly in the Los Angeles basin, are relatively young in geologic terms, often estimated between 5 and 10 million years old. By surface area density, California ranks among the most resource-rich regions in the lower 48 states. Large volumes have already been produced. Significant reserves remain technically recoverable. So the central question is not whether the resource exists, it is whether capital, infrastructure, and policy alignment will support its development. An old industry principle captures that logic. The best place to find new oil is in an old oil field. Mature basins often hold untapped zones that improved methods can unlock. California's established fields, supported by decades of geological data and infrastructure, continue to attract operators who believe additional recovery is still achievable. That belief is why many companies remain engaged despite volatility. California offers established infrastructure, mapped geology, and decades of production data, advantages that cannot be recreated quickly in a new basin. The foundation is already built. Now the debate shifts to structural questions: infrastructure stability, refining capacity, regulatory direction, and capital flow. Those variables, more than the resource itself, will determine whether the sector stabilizes or continues to contract. The stakes extend beyond individual companies. The industry's economic footprint, environmental framework, and role in long-term energy planning are all under review. Decisions made in this phase will shape supply chains, investment patterns, and market structure for years. Energy infrastructure is built over decades. It can narrow much faster. Once capacity leaves, it rarely returns. The choices made now may define California's energy landscape for a generation.